The 1970s changed animation forever. Adult-themed theatrical cartoons pushed boundaries while Saturday morning shows faced new censorship rules. Networks edited violence, parents protested content, and some cartoons disappeared entirely. Here are 6 most controversial censored cartoons of the 1970s. Number 6, Fritz the Cat, 1972. Ralph Bakshi's Fritz the Cat became the first animated feature film to receive an X rating in the United States. Based on Robert Crumb's underground comic strip, the film followed an anthropomorphic cat through 1960s New York, exploring drugs, sex, and radical politics in ways animation had never attempted before. The film's production budget was just $700,000, but it earned over $90 million worldwide, making it the most successful independent animated film of all time. That success came with intense controversy. Many viewers and critics believed they were watching pornography disguised as animation. The advertising emphasized the X rating with taglines promising 90 minutes of violence, excitement, and sex. Producer Steve Krantz appealed the X rating to the MPAA, arguing that animals having sex wasn't pornography. The appeal was rejected. 30 American newspapers refused to run advertisements for the film, and many theaters were reluctant to book it despite its commercial potential. Some newspapers that did run ads placed them in adult sections rather than entertainment pages. The controversy extended beyond explicit content. The film portrayed black characters as anthropomorphic crows speaking in stereotypical dialect. While Bakshi intended this as social commentary on racism, not everyone interpreted it that way. The racial caricatures would become even more contentious in Bakshi's later work. Critics argued that regardless of intent, the imagery was offensive and perpetuated harmful stereotypes. What makes Fritz particularly controversial is that Robert Crumb, the character's creator, hated the film. He felt Bakshi had missed the point of his creation and turned Fritz into something he never intended. Crumb saw his character as a sophisticated commentary on counterculture phoniness, but felt Bakshi had made an exploitation film. The adaptation felt like a betrayal of his artistic vision. Crumb was so disgusted that he published a comic later in 1972 called Fritz the Cat, Superstar, where a jealous girlfriend kills Fritz with an ice pick. Crumb refused to use the character again and wrote the filmmakers demanding they never adapt his work again. In a 2008 interview, Crumb called watching the film an excruciating ordeal, a humiliating embarrassment. The behind-the-scenes drama added to the controversy. Crumb claimed he never agreed to the film rights. According to him, his wife Dana signed the contract because she had power of attorney over him. Crumb received $50,000 and 10% of Krantz's proceeds, but felt cheated when the film became a massive hit. The legal and financial disputes became part of the film's notoriety. The film sparked debates about whether animation could be art for adults or whether it would always be seen as children's entertainment. Bakshi proved there was an audience for adult animation, but the path was rough. Critics accused him of exploiting animation for shock value. Defenders argued he was pushing the medium forward and challenging preconceptions about what animated films could be. When previewed at the University of Southern California, Bakshi had to firmly state that Fritz the Cat was not pornographic, but the damage was done. The film's reputation preceded it, and many people made up their minds without seeing it. The controversy overshadowed the film's actual satirical content about 1960s counterculture, racism, and political hypocrisy. Fritz the Cat changed animation forever, proving that cartoons could be made for adult audiences. But it also demonstrated how controversial content could both help and hurt a film's reception. The X rating brought attention, but also kept mainstream audiences away. The financial success encouraged more adult animation, but the controversy made studios cautious about how far they could push boundaries. Number 5. Heavy Traffic, 1973. Ralph Bakshi followed Fritz the Cat with Heavy Traffic, a film even more controversial than its predecessor. The 1973 animated feature combined live action and animation to tell the story of Michael Corleone, a 22-year-old virgin cartoonist in New York City whose fantasies came to life through animation. Heavy Traffic received an X rating, despite theaters being more willing to screen adult animated features after Fritz's success. The film explored urban decay, racism, violence, and sexuality through Michael's increasingly surreal fantasies. The opening and ending used live action, with animation depicting Michael's inner world. Bakshi's production methods were experimental and controversial. He used actual photographs of New York locations as backgrounds, intentionally printing them out of focus to create a dreamlike quality. The film mixed street photography with animation in ways that felt uncomfortably real for many viewers. The Canadian province of Alberta banned the film outright when it was originally released. Their film censorship board deemed it too graphic and disturbing for any audience. This ban lasted for years, making Heavy Traffic one of the few animated films to face government censorship in North America during the 1970s. Critics were divided. Newsweek praised the film's black humor, powerful grotesquerie, and peculiar raw beauty, calling it a celebration of urban decay. The New York Times noted that unlike Fritz the Cat, which adapted existing material, Heavy Traffic was purely Bakshi's vision, showing his development as a filmmaker. The controversy around Heavy Traffic stemmed from its uncompromising portrayal of city life. Bakshi didn't sanitize or romanticize urban poverty, violence, and racial tension. Characters used racist slurs, engaged in violence, and participated in criminal activities. The film showed prostitution, drug use, and sexual situations in ways that made viewers uncomfortable. Bakshi and producer Steve Krantz had financial disagreements during production. Krantz claimed Fritz the Cat hadn't made money despite obvious evidence to the contrary, including his new BMW and Beverly Hills mansion. Bakshi had to seek advice from Martin Scorsese, Francis Ford Coppola, and Steven Spielberg about fair compensation, learning that he'd been cheated. Despite the controversy and X rating, Heavy Traffic was a box office success. Ralph Bakshi became the first person in the animation industry since Walt Disney to have two financially successful films back-to-back. The film is now considered Bakshi's biggest critical success, though it remains difficult to find due to its controversial content. The film's legacy is complex. It pushed animation further into adult territory, proving Fritz the Cat wasn't a fluke. But it also reinforced concerns that adult animation would always be synonymous with explicit content rather than mature storytelling. Networks wouldn't touch anything like Heavy Traffic for Saturday morning programming. Number 4. Coonskin, 1975. Originally titled Harlem Nights, Coonskin became one of the most controversial animated films ever made. Ralph Bakshi's 1975 satire adapted Uncle Remus folktales, following Brother Rabbit, Brother Bear, and Preacher Fox as they rise through Harlem's criminal underworld. The controversy began before the film's theatrical release. The Congress of Racial Equality, CORE, protested the film, accusing it of being racist despite never having seen it. They organized demonstrations and disrupted advanced screenings with aggressive tactics. CORE saw an opportunity for publicity and media attention, positioning themselves as defenders of black dignity against Hollywood exploitation. Paramount Pictures, the original distributor, dropped the film entirely under pressure from civil rights groups. The studio decided the controversy wasn't worth the potential profit. This left Bakshi and producer Albert S. Ruddy scrambling to find a new distributor willing to take the risk. The film used deliberately offensive racial caricatures from blackface minstrelsy and racist Hollywood imagery. Brother Rabbit was drawn with burnt cork coloring, exaggerated features, and grotesque proportions. Bakshi's intention was to satirize and condemn racism by exposing these stereotypes, not celebrate them. He wanted to take the offensive imagery from films like Song of the South and flip it on its head, using the very symbols of oppression to critique American society. The film also featured equally exaggerated portrayals of white characters. Southern whites were drawn as grotesque rednecks, Italian mobsters as bloated caricatures, and wealthy whites at fancy dinners were shown in live action. rendering their real existence as more cartoonish than the animated characters. Bakshi caricatured Jews using imagery from Nazi propaganda, though he himself was Jewish. His satirical approach spared no one. Producer Albert S. Ruddy, fresh off The Godfather's massive success, believed in the project and had the clout to get it made. When Paramount dropped it, Ruddy and Bakshi were released from their contract. Bryanston Distributing Company picked up the film, but went bankrupt 2 weeks after it opened. The timing couldn't have been worse, leaving Coonskin without proper distribution or marketing support just as it was generating both interest and outrage. The controversy intensified when protesters set off smoke bombs in theaters showing the film. Screenings became dangerous, with audiences never knowing if they'd make it through a showing without disruption. When Martin Scorsese was filming Taxi Driver near Times Square in 1976, he captured footage of people running out of a theater showing Coonskin after protesters disrupted the screening. Ben Gage was hired to re-record some of Barry White's voice tracks to remove racist references and vulgarity, but this sanitization was minimal and unsatisfying to everyone. The film was retitled Bustin' Out and later Street Fight in attempts to distance it from the controversy, but nothing helped. Each new title just confused audiences and failed to overcome the film's reputation. Surprisingly, the NAACP actually supported the film, calling it a difficult satire that condemned racism. Film critic Arthur Knight wrote that Coonskin wasn't anti-black, anti-Jewish, anti-Italian, or anti-American, despite caricaturing all these groups equally. Roger Ebert argued that the film was being used as a philosophical ping-pong ball, with its original satirical intent lost in the controversy. He wrote that Bakshi's ambitious movie was being sold as the very thing it wasn't. Bakshi hired several black animators and graffiti artists to work on the film, a first for animated features. He collaborated with Scatman Crothers and Barry White, who appeared in both live-action and animated sequences. The production aimed to critique Song of the South's racist imagery by exposing and exaggerating it. Bakshi believed that showing racism's ugliness in stark terms would force audiences to confront it rather than ignore it. A young Al Sharpton was among the protesters. Bakshi later called him a black middle-class sellout who exploited the controversy for personal publicity. Bakshi has repeatedly stated that Coonskin is his best film, despite, or perhaps because of, the controversy that nearly destroyed his career. The protests and censorship attempts convinced him the film was hitting its target, making people uncomfortable with American racism. The film has been reappraised in recent years as the condemnation of racism Bakshi intended. A New York Times review declared it could be Ralph Bakshi's masterpiece. Modern critics understand the satirical intent better than 1975 audiences did. But for decades, Coonskin was nearly impossible to see, kept out of circulation by the controversy that surrounded it. The film remains difficult viewing, confronting audiences with imagery that's painful regardless of satirical intent. Number 3, Tom and Jerry shorts edited for television. Throughout the 1970s, television networks heavily censored Tom and Jerry cartoons for broadcast. These theatrical shorts from the 1940s and 1950s faced increasing scrutiny from parents' groups and network censors who found content inappropriate for children. The most controversial edits involved racial content. The character Mammy Two Shoes, a black maid who appeared in numerous shorts, was either edited out entirely or had her dialogue redubbed. In Mouse Cleaning, an explosion makes Tom's face black, and Mammy Two Shoes asks him if he's seen a cat, with Tom responding in stereotypical dialect. This sequence was cut from television broadcasts. Violence was another major concern. Tom and Jerry's cartoon violence, guns, explosives, knives, and constant physical harm came under fire from Action for Children's Television and similar advocacy groups. Networks began cutting violent sequences or editing them to reduce impact. Smoking was systematically removed from the cartoons. Tom lighting cigars or cigarettes appeared in multiple shorts, and these scenes were either cut entirely or digitally altered in later years. The UK specifically banned episodes featuring Tom smoking large cigars considering them too influential on young viewers. The censorship created awkward edits where scenes suddenly jumped or made no logical sense. A Tom and Jerry short might establish a setup, then cut directly to the conclusion with the middle section removed. Viewers who remembered the original theatrical versions noticed these jarring transitions. Some shorts were pulled from rotation entirely, rather than heavily edited. Episodes considered too violent or containing too much racial content simply disappeared from Saturday morning lineups. Independent stations that owned syndication rights sometimes chose never to air certain episodes. The irony was that these cartoons were originally made for theatrical release to adult and family audiences, not specifically for children. The violence and content made sense in that context, but as they became Saturday morning staples in the 1960s and 1970s, they were judged by different standards. Network censors worked overtime to maintain Tom and Jerry's popularity while sanitizing content. The goal was keeping the cartoons on air without offending parents or advocacy groups. This meant constant editing, remastering, and decisions about what could and couldn't be shown. By the late 1970s, Tom and Jerry had been edited so extensively that some episodes were half their original length. What remained were the basic chase sequences without the violent payoffs or controversial characters that were integral to the original shorts. The censorship reflected changing attitudes about what was appropriate for children. Content that seemed harmless in the 1940s was now considered problematic, but many questioned whether editing cartoon violence, while real violence appeared on news broadcasts, made logical sense. Number 2. Looney Tunes and Merry Melodies violence edits. Looney Tunes and Merry Melodies shorts faced similar censorship issues as Tom and Jerry during the 1970s. Warner Brothers cartoons that had entertained theatrical audiences for decades were now being heavily edited for Saturday morning broadcast. The major networks, ABC, CBS, and NBC, had different standards for what they would air. First-run networks had stricter censorship than independent stations that ran syndicated Warner Brothers cartoons. This created a confusing situation where the same cartoon might air uncensored on one channel and heavily edited on another. Chuck Jones, one of the legendary Warner Brothers directors, commented on television censorship in 1983, "I don't like to see the films cut at all. They make some cuts that are so arbitrary and stupid, you can't believe it." He was particularly frustrated by how censors made decisions without understanding the cartoon's artistic intent. Violent scenes were the primary target. Bugs Bunny couldn't shoot Elmer Fudd in the face. Daffy Duck couldn't have his bill blown off by shotguns. Wile E. Coyote's elaborate schemes to catch the Roadrunner were edited to remove the most violent impacts. Even the famous "That's all, folks" ending with Porky Pig was sometimes altered if the preceding scene was too violent. Suicide references were completely banned. Any cartoon that featured a character attempting suicide, even as comedy, was either heavily edited or removed from broadcast. Good News, a 1962 Daffy Duck cartoon about hanging, was rarely aired in its 60-year existence due to its subject matter. Explosions, falling anvils, and dynamite, staples of Looney Tunes humor, all faced scrutiny. Networks worried that children would imitate dangerous behaviors they saw in cartoons. The fact that these were obviously impossible cartoon physics didn't matter to concerned parents' groups. Racial content also faced censorship. Cartoons featuring Speedy Gonzales were controversial because some considered him a Mexican stereotype. Other shorts with racial caricatures were quietly removed from rotation, though they weren't part of the official censored 11 from earlier decades. The censorship created a generation gap. Adults who remembered watching these cartoons theatrically or on early television were confused by the edited versions their children saw. The cartoons felt incomplete, with jokes that no longer made sense because the setup or payoff had been removed. Networks argued they were responding to parental concerns and FCC pressure. Studies claimed that children who watched cartoon violence showed increased aggression. The networks didn't want congressional hearings or new regulations, so they censored content preemptively. Independent stations weren't bound by the same rules, so some viewers could still see relatively uncensored Looney Tunes on local channels, while network broadcasts were heavily edited. This created confusion about which version was real. The censorship had a chilling effect on new animation. Studios producing cartoons for Saturday morning knew they had to avoid anything that might be controversial. This led to increasingly bland, safe content that older viewers found boring and repetitive. Number 1. Hong Kong Phooey and Racial Concerns. Hong Kong Phooey premiered on ABC in September 1974 and immediately faced controversy. The Hanna-Barbera cartoon featured Penrod Penry Pooch, a mild-mannered police station janitor who transformed into Hong Kong Phooey, a kung fu fighting superhero. The show arrived during the kung fu craze sparked by Bruce Lee films and the TV series Kung Fu starring David Carradine. Networks wanted to capitalize on this trend, and Hong Kong Phooey was ABC's entry into martial arts entertainment for children. The problem was how the show portrayed Asian culture and martial arts through a distinctly American lens. Critics argued that Hong Kong Phooey was an Asian stereotype despite the main character being a dog. His pidgin English catchphrases, exaggerated martial arts moves, and the generic Oriental aesthetic troubled Asian American advocacy groups who were just beginning to find their voice in media criticism. The 1970s saw the early stirrings of organized Asian American activism, though it wouldn't reach full strength until later decades. The character's voice, provided by Scatman Crothers, used an accent that some found offensive. Hong Kong Phooey spoke with verbal tics and pronunciation that played into stereotypes about how Asian people spoke English. The show's humor often derived from Hong Kong Phooey's incompetence despite his confidence, with the dog constantly bungling cases while proclaiming his kung fu superiority. Interestingly, Hong Kong Phooey was actually terrible at kung fu. He bumbled through adventures, succeeding largely by accident, while his cat Spot did the real work. Spot, who couldn't talk, was the actual hero of most episodes, solving crimes while Hong Kong Phooey took credit. This inept characterization added another layer of controversy. Was the show saying Asian martial arts were fraudulent, or that those who practiced them were incompetent fools? The show's Asian visual elements, dragons, yin-yang symbols, pagodas, chopsticks, and fortune cookies, were used decoratively without cultural context or respect. Everything Oriental was mixed together regardless of whether it came from Chinese, Japanese, Korean, or other Asian cultures. This cultural mashup reflected 1970s American ignorance about Asian diversity, treating all Asian cultures as interchangeable parts of an exotic whole. Bruce Lee had died in July 1973, just over a year before Hong Kong Phooey premiered. Lee had worked hard to present martial arts seriously and to combat Asian stereotypes in Hollywood. Hong Kong Phooey, arriving so soon after his death, felt like a step backward to many who admired what Lee had accomplished in changing American perceptions of Asian culture and martial arts. ABC received complaints from Asian American groups, though organized criticism wasn't as strong as it would have been in later decades. The 1970s predated many of the organized advocacy groups that would challenge media stereotypes in the 1980s and 1990s. Asian Americans were still relatively few in the entertainment industry and lacked the platforms to effectively protest shows like Hong Kong Phooey. The show lasted only 16 episodes across one season before being canceled. Low ratings contributed to the cancellation, but the controversy didn't help. Children didn't embrace the show as strongly as ABC had hoped, perhaps sensing something off about its tone. Hong Kong Phooey continued to air in reruns throughout the 1970s and 1980s, exposing new generations to its problematic content. What's particularly notable is that nobody involved in creating Hong Kong Phooey thought they were doing anything wrong. The creators saw it as a fun action comedy that celebrated kung fu during its peak popularity. They didn't understand why anyone would find it offensive. Hanna-Barbera had good intentions, wanting to capitalize on children's interest in martial arts while creating another superhero for Saturday mornings. This reflected the broader disconnect in 1970s children's programming. Studios and networks were just beginning to grapple with representation and stereotypes. What seemed like harmless fun to white creators in California looked very different to the communities being caricatured. The entertainment industry's lack of diversity meant few Asian voices were in the room when Kong Phooey was created. Kong Phooey represents a transitional moment in animation. It was created before networks had strong diversity guidelines, but aired as those concerns were becoming more prominent. The show's controversy helped shape future policies about cultural representation in Saturday morning cartoons. Networks began consulting with advocacy groups and adding diversity consultants to avoid similar missteps. Decades later, Kong Phooey is recognized as a product of its time, with all the problematic elements that implies. It remains available on streaming services with disclaimers about outdated cultural depictions. Watching it now provides a window into how the 1970s treated Asian culture as exotic entertainment without deeper understanding. The show stands as a reminder that good intentions don't excuse cultural insensitivity. The 1970s were a turning point for animation. Theatrical cartoons pushed into adult territory, while Saturday morning shows faced increasing censorship. Networks edited classic cartoons, banned violent content, and grappled with racial stereotypes. Parents' groups gained influence, changing what could and couldn't be shown to children on television. These controversies shaped modern animation in ways we're still experiencing. The battles fought in the 1970s over content, representation, and appropriateness continue today with different players but similar arguments. We're still debating what's acceptable in cartoons and who gets to decide those standards. Ralph Bakshi proved that adult animation could be commercially successful, paving the way for everything from The Simpsons to South Park to modern adult animation on streaming services. But he also showed how controversial content could limit distribution and create lasting reputation problems. Studios learned to be strategic about how far they pushed boundaries. The censorship of classic cartoons in the 1970s established patterns that continue. Violence is edited, racial content is removed or contextualized with disclaimers, and entire episodes disappear from circulation. What the 1970s began, later decades amplified. Modern streaming services face similar decisions about classic content, balancing historical preservation with contemporary sensitivity. The controversial cartoons of the 1970s remind us that animation has always been more than children's entertainment. It's been a battlefield for cultural values, artistic freedom, and social change. These cartoons forced conversations about racism, violence, sexuality, and what children should see. Some of these cartoons deserved the controversy they received. Others were unfairly targeted. All of them reveal what America was struggling with during a decade of tremendous change. If you enjoyed this look back at controversial animation history, give this video a like and subscribe for more deep dives into the cartoons that sparked debate and shaped our culture.